Habari. I hope that you all are doing well. Today I have a presentation for you. Yes, another presentation, but this presentation is very important. Not saying that my other presentations aren't important, but I do ask that you please be willing to see this presentation all the way through. I am going to cover not only the 5 Native American tribes who enslaved the African Americans who identify as Native American. I'm also going to cover part of the FBA. I'm going to speak about issues with us identifying just as Black. And I'm also going to touch on some reparations and how we can begin to rebuild that independence. But this presentation, it flows through it. So I just need you to be patient with me, please. I appreciate those of you who have recently subscribed to my channel. But I want to touch on something really quickly. A lot of people like to throw out, especially with Candace Owens out there promoting this victimhood mentality. Well, let's think about this. There are 42 million people in the United States, a lot of us who are still asleep to what we are dealing with. But all 42 million of us, approximately, you know what I'm trying to say, the English language, my tongue, I am telling you, my tongue is trying to get back to my roots. But all 42 million of us cannot be suffering under some victimhood mentality, just like all 14 to 15 million, which I'm sure the number is higher, who were stolen from Africa and transported as chattel, cannot all be suffering under some victimhood mentality. Maybe they actually were victims, and maybe we are actually victims of this circumstance, but I am trying to help promote that we do not have to remain the victims of this circumstance, that we can rise out of this. So without further ado, I'm going to get into this presentation today. Now, one thing I would like to point out to you, in this title, I spell Africa sometimes with a K and sometimes with a C. I do that strategically to try to not only connect both spellings of the words, but also to take us into the past and present as I am speaking through this presentation. So the first thing that I would like to talk about here is our forgotten birthright. As I said, a lot of us identify as Native American, as Black, Indian. But getting in here, there's a recent story that came out of how this family here, this two pair here, from the Muskogee tribe, Muskogee court affirms citizenship for descendants of people enslaved by this tribe. Now, as history may or most likely may have not taught you, during the transatlantic slave trade, the 5 American Indian tribes who were persuaded by the European to partake in chattel enslavement of the African were the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Seminole tribe. Now, these tribes were categorized by the European as the 5 civilized tribes. The 5 civilized tribes. See how they are already working on that mentality, working on that psychology to get you into believing that you need to be a part of the 5 civilized tribes. So after the abolishment, quote unquote, of slavery, the quote unquote abolishment of slavery in the U.S., it was required that the 5 tribes honor the bill by releasing the Africans enslaved and offer extension of citizenship along with land rights. Those of African descent who were enslaved by either of the 5 tribes are now known as freedman, not African. And that's something important that I want to point out. A lot of people will say we are the freed man. We are the FBAs, still distancing from the fact that those who were enslaved by these 5 tribes were transported, brought, shipped from Africa, from the continent we now call Africa. They were shipped here. And instead of trying to get back to the root, to get that citizenship which was stolen from those ancestors where they were displaced, you are bypassing that and saying, well, I want to get the citizenship of those who enslaved my ancestors. instead of rebuilding the citizenship that was stolen from them where they actually belong. So this is getting into the next title, 1865. The next phase, whether you believe it or not, it is the next phase of the divide and conquer. The European was calculated enough to require extended citizenship to the enslaved African by either of the five civilized Native American tribes, but not conscious enough to require replacement of the African back to their native homeland, their family tree, our family tree, which remains divided and scattered by way of separate nationalities due to the transatlantic slave trade. I don't think that's done purposely. I don't think they just didn't think about it. Of course, they have thought about this, but they knew what they were doing. This is what we need to start thinking. We need to get in the mindset of someone who thinks strategically 100% of the day. There is always strategy going on in the mind of the European. And the less we are emotional and the more that we are strategic, we can catch on. So by erasing our ancestors' history, which bleeds through our veins, we erase their desire to be reconnected and restored to the families and land of which they knew before separation. We dishonor our ancestors by placing citizenship of the five civilized tribes in hierarchy above our true birthright. Thus, by way of manipulation, divide and conquer tactics, we keep for generations to come our ancestors' wishes beneath our own ego and need for acceptance into a civilized society. We must detach from Africa's shame. I have been hearing this. I even got a quote about this on one of my videos. We are trying to detach from Africa's shame. Well, who placed that shame in you? Who told you to be shameful in the first place? This is what we're not thinking. You are continuing to fall for ignorance. Fall for ignorance's games and manipulations. So getting into the I'm Black, FBA, and I am proud. Funny how you'll never hear the freedman or FBA shout in protests or even in media, I'm African and I'm proud. Never do I hear that. Confirmed accounts have proven that since the transatlantic slave trade was a plot to eradicate the African by attacking various ethnic groups by way of genocide. Here's your proof here. There are many proofs. All you have to do is do the research. But even here in Germany, they have confirmed and finally acknowledged that yes, we have done this to you. And when you talk about a lot of people, these FBAs will say, well, they're fighting for their own reparations. They're going out here doing their own thing. That is because they acknowledge not only that they come from an African tribe, while you are only connected to Black, they acknowledge that, yes, we are African, and this is the ethnic group that you committed genocide on. So there's two separate things happening here. It's not that they're getting reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. They're getting reparations for the genocide that occurred in that specific ethnic group. And a lot of people will go on and they will say, well, we've been here for 400 years. You have to also think about the fact that genocide was committed. It is even confirmed that only 4% of the people taken from Africa were brought to the North America. Majority of the people were actually placed in the Caribbean because of the sugarcane, plantations. So we have to think about how much genocide was actually committed. And doing that research, we can figure out, how close we actually are on the timeline of being connected to Africa. And actually 400 years is not even that far off. But getting back into this, confirmed accounts have proven that since the transatlantic slave trade was a plot to eradicate the African by various indigenous to eradicate the African by attacking various indigenous ethnic groups by way of genocide. So since we could not be destroyed physically, our mental became the focus. It was never the intention of the Transatlantic to restore Africa's stolen children back to the motherland. Anyone playing chess to win understands you do not give up all of your pieces willingly. Restoration of the African back to their original land and family trees would mean intentional preservation of our records, not destruction. It was never the intent to have us rejoined, as FBAs will claim that the European named us African American because they want to have us connected to Africa. No, rather we're left scattered throughout the Transatlantic with divided titles. Ignorance only intention was to create shame within our blood, national and tribal hierarchy, thus convincing you to fight for black opposite of white, keeping misery company in a fictional crayon box. By denying your ancestors' wishes, separated from their land and family trees, you help ensure that the European globally will never atone for their sins, and that the African globally remains trapped in an endless battle of hierarchy. What instilled shame within us? That's what we need to be discussing, not how to detach from the shame. Who put that shame within us? So prior to 1444, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, the people of Africa were diverse yet connected through trade. Even with the Arab slave trade in motion and slavery within African communities, nothing would compare to what the European would bring and take to and from Africa's borders. Understanding slavery with different African communities demands stepping outside of comparison. Well, Africans enslaved other Africans too. So what's the problem? For the purposes of education, moving forward away from confusion and dismissal of its ongoing effects, I'll refer to the transatlantic slave trade as a more fitting term: the transatlantic African massacre by trade. Although W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the first scholars to describe the transatlantic slave trade as such, today, more and more, we are finding this term being used to compare and dismiss rather than to acknowledge with truth its brutality and effects. The European, with its need to dominate and eradicate, instilled shame onto the African people, placed abroad due to its madness massacre. The European stole something enormous from Africa's people that has yet to be restored. Now is the time we eradicate the disease called shame within us, calling checkmate to their horsemen as we rise above stronger than ever in human history. Stronger than ever before in human history. A lot of us, I have said, we need to honor the ancestors. We need to, if you want to get with me, you got to get with my ancestors. You got to get right with my ancestors. Even with us in the community, if you want to get with me, and we are both melanated, we are both African, you got to get right with your ancestors. Okay. That does not mean that our ancestors did not have lessons to also learn, lessons that we are supposed to learn from their mistakes, such as what were we supposed to do when slavery ended? Were we supposed to be breaking bread with our captors? Were we supposed to fall into the trap that we are in now? Were we supposed to remain divided and conquered? It's taking what the good and the bad of that and learning from it, learning from them, and becoming a wise ancestor ourselves. So, when we talk about shame and you say that you have this shame, I want to point out real shame that we should acknowledge. Not shame of Africa, but the shame on us. Shame on us. Shame as we allow our ancestors to be reduced to the time of the transatlantic massacres. That's shame on us. Shame as we allow reverse psychology to psych us out of our heritage. Shame on us. Shame as we choose color as heritage instead of being African. Shame as we fight the reflection in the mirror and around the globe, fighting the reflection, fighting your naturalness, fighting your complexion, fighting what you see, and trying to compare it to a European standard. Shame as we allow our past enslavers, ones who committed genocide on our ancestors, forgotten by the world, to teach us. That's the shame on us. Shame as we submit to ignorance. Well, you can't wear a bonnet out in public because what will the white people say? Shame on us. Shame as we remain fearful of a long overdue argument to avenge our ancestors, past and present, to come. Shame for remaining divided and conquered for $1. Shame for fighting for citizenship from those who enslaved our ancestors instead of demanding our true citizenship to the motherland be restored free of charge. Shame but for believing our captors would become our friends. A friend is selfless, remorseful of wrongdoings, and treats you as equal partners, honors your heroes just as much as theirs. President's Day. Shame for believing we needed to equate ourselves to them. Shame for falling for the greatest con in human history. We keep falling for it. Black inside the box. Get out the crayon box. It stated that with the rise of Black power, we in America began to identify as Black, counter to those who identify as white. If we can understand the history behind white being created in the 1600s, used to place superiority and dominance over those us, non-white, thinking psychologically, we can understand why Black power was born, again, counter to white. So without the creation of white, there would have never been a need for Black power. Do you see what I'm saying? There would have never been a need for Black power without the creation of white. Instead of dismantling white, we joined the game, but with our pieces scattered. Transatlantic. It's been a never-ending fight to prove ourselves as worthy, human, and equal to a system of ignorance. While white, again, was created as a race, we now use Black as a weapon against our ancestors to slice separation from our brothers and sisters abroad and on the motherland. So now we're using the same the same tactics that they used on us because we have learned from ignorance. Ignorance has been our teacher this entire time. Ignorance is still our teacher. And we are doing what was done to us to our own people. Kemet was the land of Blacks, but its people existed and thrived outside of the color box. So I want to talk about this because reparations, this is just a brief example. I wrote comparison charts, for those of us thinking in an independent state of mind, and maybe you haven't thought of these, maybe you have better ideas, but it's good that we come together and know what we are going to take, what we are going to demand once we become independent. But on the left side of this chart are just a few examples, if not the majority of what I have found that the FBAs are fighting for in America. You're fighting for infrastructure. You're fighting for educational assistance, housing assistance, cannabis rights, land grants, cannabis rights. No, nothing against, I'm not trying to, I know people, smoke the marijuana and everything. And there's nothing against, not trying to attack the marijuana smokers. Okay. Obviously you can tell I don't smoke. So what I'm saying is you're looking for cannabis rights. You're looking for land grants, housing assistance, educational assistance, instead of taking what you are owed so that you no longer need assistance. You no longer will need assistance. If you look at the right, what we should have demanded from the start was our reconnection back to the motherland, not reconnection back to those who enslaved us, saying, well, I want the citizenship of those who enslaved my ancestors instead of the citizenship that I am owed, that belonged to my ancestors, that was stolen from them. Free ancestry DNA tests. Is that not something that anyone is thinking about? Why are we paying for this? We should not be paying any money for this. This is our right, but we're paying for it. Free passage, transatlantic. Do you understand what that would mean? You will no longer need a passport to get to Europe, to travel throughout the Europe. Even in Europe, they don't need passports to travel throughout Europe, but you need passports to travel throughout Africa. There's a problem with that. So you would no longer need passports to travel throughout Europe. You would no longer need passports to travel throughout Africa. You would no longer need passports to travel throughout the Caribbean. That's the least that we could demand and take. That's the least of it. But saying that we have that free passage means we can then build, as they say, gatekeepers. The gate is torn down and we have a chance to reconnect. We have a chance to rebuild with our family. That is most important. We need that bond. Free restoration of African citizenship. Okay. As I said, that's part of that African ancestry DNA. When you go and they welcome you back home, you have to pay all these fees. You have to pay a price tag for your birth certificate, for your birthright. That should be free, considering what has happened. Restoration of African artifacts and history. When we restore the artifacts, because they are scattered in different museums throughout the world that do not belong to those particular museums, we then begin to take back the intelligence that has been scattered and buried and given credit to other communities, other groups of people. There is importance in restoring the intelligence globally, making it known there is importance of this, so that we are no longer believing that we need to dumb ourselves down to the education of ignorance, the education of those who still identify themselves as a color of white. We can remember where the indigenous intelligence thrives. It's just like, I was following ADDI and they're saying, hey, we have free French lessons. Come take free French lessons. So although they are for the Pan-African movement, what's wrong here is that we should not be still learning free colonized languages. We should be learning the indigenous African language. A lot of people, they will say, hey, I'm taking these lessons. I'm taking German. I'm taking French. I'm taking Mandarin. Well, how often do you hear anyone who is Black, African, say, I am learning these indigenous, I am taking Swahili, I am taking these indigenous African languages. We need to place intelligence. We need to place superiority back to the indigenous African. That must be restored. And then, restoration of African people and land. You're talking about just compare the two. And, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And this is just a small comparison. But when we fight for independence and you're no longer living in the house of your oppressor, there is so much more that you can demand. There is so much more that you can take when you come together. But when you're fighting for reparations in the very same house that once enslaved your ancestors, there's only so much that you can get. Assistance. Give us assistance. We want educational assistance. Still want to educate our children based off of a colonial educational system, instead of getting back to our roots, getting back to the true intelligence of this planet. These are things that we have to think about. Now, getting into rebuilding. Before Africa can rebuild, its soil must be decontaminated. Anything that blossoms, blooms out of a healthy foundation. Mentally, Africa's children on the continent and spread abroad remain contaminated with poisonous minds, growing decay from the transatlantic. We've taken on the mindset of the colonizer in Africa by charging a fee for her children to return home, by hiking the prices of goods and land to those separated and now returning. We've taken on the mindset of the oppressor by allowing fear to drive hate into our hearts, thus further keeping Africa's children divided. Just think about it. We furthermore have become our colonizer by creating Black supremacy within, falling for tribal hierarchy, colorism, texturism, capitalism, anti-Blackness, so much more. To rebuild the African within and build stronger than ever before, we must wipe the system of race from our minds and rebuild without the influence or approval of a white world, which was created in the 1600s, by the way. Rebuild our minds from the stem up, away from racism, white supremacy. We must take and acknowledge the good along with the bad our ancestors have taught us. Use them as a guiding force for a better future, choosing each other over the captor, disguised as their descendants, for they are their ancestors. Let me say that again. Choosing each other over the captor, disguised as their descendants, for they are their ancestors. We must choose each other because we believe, and I'm telling you, I am, if you understand the spirit, you understand the spirit world, you understand earth, you understand the universe. I am telling you, you understand that your ancestors are within you. You feel your ancestors. Do you not believe that their ancestors are not inside of them? Have a real conversation with them. You will see their ancestors from the 1600s show their faces. You will see their ancestors from the 1700s show their faces. You will see their ancestors from the 1500s show their faces. They have never been remorseful. They have never done the work. They have never been held accountable. What happens when you have never done the work, never been held accountable? Do you think that you can grow and heal without doing any work? Those ancestors are still there, and we keep choosing them over ourselves. They are very strategic. They are still just strategic in how they deal with you, how they interact with you. And you don't believe it. You must become strategic right along with them if you are dealing with them. Keep them at a distance. That is the unfortunate truth that a lot of people do not want to hear. Because then I will sound like the bad guy. I'm the one that's creating reverse racism. Okay. But I am telling you, in order for us to rebuild, we have to understand who we are, who our opponents are. You have to understand your opponent instead of falling for your opponent. Understand who your opponent is. And we can get there. We have so much work to do, but I believe we can do it. We just have to get these messages out. We have to do the work daily. We have to look in the mirror. Look at me. Look at my hair. It took a lot for me to finally learn to love the naturalness of myself. Just let my hair do what it wants. I am allowing my hair to go through this transformation as I am growing locks. I am in the starter lock phase. There are so many people There are so many people in the starter lock community who give up because they do not like the texture of their hair. They allow influences around the world. They allow influences in their relationships, their personal relationships, to tell them, well, you should cut your locks off because they no longer look good. And then you begin to doubt the reflection staring back at you. You begin to re-examine your hair and say, well, maybe I should cut it off. It's not your hair that needs to be re-examined. It's that relationship that needs to be re-examined. That is why I am telling you, entering into even within our own community, when we still operate with anti-blackness. You may have decolonized one part of the brain, one tiny part of the brain, but it does not mean that other parts of the brain are still not colonized in a way. Just like, Beyonce can say that she loves, Jay-Z with his natural hair. She loves the locks. Doesn't mean that she wants to walk around and wearing them herself. There's a difference in saying that this looks good on somebody, this looks good on you, versus actually living it daily within yourself. There's a lot of work that we have to do. I believe we can get there. We have to get there if we expect to have true liberation and independence.